LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the March 28th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I'll be using the 11 best, most newsworthy clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be a really informative, educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all tonight. My clip list is at a link down in the video description, along with the source of all my clips. The clip list is like my cryptic notes that I use to figure out what I was supposed to say before or after I show all the clips. The main topic is New Jim Crow in Georgia, which is about this voter suppression law passed in Georgia that was covered by all the big five corporate outlets, although they all had different spins on what's the big story this week. It's in some ways it's kind of refreshing because it always used to be Trump, and now we actually have issue topics like the new Jim Crow in Georgia. But I actually considered briefly. I just finished watching all 6 seasons of Schitt's Creek, and so I thought of calling it the new Jim Crow, the Crowaning. But I don't know. I thought that was a little bit too obscure for most viewers. Anyway, I will be talking about this new law that makes it harder for people to vote. Most infamously, it stops people from giving food or water to people standing in line, even though people have to stand in line for hours in Georgia. It closes some polling places at 5 p.m. And one of the most nefarious things it does is it gives the state legislature the power to overturn the results from those local county boards and say, no, the state legislature is going to certify the results, not like the local Fulton County board or whatever that's controlled by Democrats, and Republicans control the state legislature, that kind of thing. So that will all be covered. I will also briefly cover the uptick in coronavirus cases. That will be the final clip I show, is Dr. Anthony Fauci warning of this increase. I've been talking about that for a few weeks. And then the political comedy clip I want to start sharing with you is just a brief clip from Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live last night. Michael Che talking about over my left shoulder here is this book, The New Jim Crow, which is about mass incarceration. It's a great book by Micheal Alexander, who used to work for the ACLU of Northern California, where I am. And I've been a volunteer with the ACLU of Northern California for a long time. And she then wrote this book that actually repudiated some of the things the ACLU was doing, and saying that the system itself was racist. It was a new form of Jim Crow, that mass incarceration. And I've talked about that many, many times in 2 weeks, it'll actually be 8 years I've been doing this every Sunday, and that is not the new Jim Crow that everybody's been talking about this week. The Jim Crow they've been talking about is either the voter suppression laws that Republicans are passing all over the country, I think in 43 states, and especially this one that passed in Georgia last week. And then also, there's been talk of the filibuster. I've been talking about filibuster reform for months now, and it's finally getting more news coverage, and people in Joe Biden's first press conference, he was asked if it was a Jim Crow relic, and he said it was. That's debatable, since the old Jim Crow didn't start till after the failure of Reconstruction, and the filibuster actually predates the Civil War. So that isn't technically true, but definitely has a Jim Crow history. And that's something Michael Che was talking about in the political comedy clip I want to start the show with tonight, over here.
Some Democrats are demanding the Senate put an end to the filibuster rule, which some call a Jim Crow relic. Also a Jim Crow relic, some senators. Virginia.
Now, I actually have 2 Republican senator clips coming up talking about the Georgia law, but neither of them were in that picture. Although one of them, maybe he should have been Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham has the most reactionary, claims that the whole thing is playing the race card, though I have some viewers who might like that point of view, and then I have a more moderate, retiring Republican, Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, who still kind of does a softer version of what Lindsey Graham does. If you're following along in the clip list, that'll be clips 9 and 10, the last two clips before the final Dr. Anthony Fauci clip. But as usual, I'm going to show you the news summaries from all 5 of the big 5 corporate outlets, and I'm putting them in order from the longest to the shortest. And this week again, NBC News Meet the Press has the longest news summary, but it's not about, you'll see Chuck Todd briefly talks about some of the topics, but this is the special edition. Sometimes they say that it's a special edition of Meet the Press, and I wasn't sure what that mean or what that was supposed to mean, but then there's this special title all during the program. It's Mass Shootings, the Battle Over Guns, because there have been multiple mass shootings. I was almost considering saying that mass shootings aren't news. They obviously are news, but they're not new, I guess. But they're an ongoing problem that just racks up the casualties. Not as many as we are getting from COVID-19, which I'm covering in the final clip. But anyway, that is an issue that you'll see the other news programs cover briefly, but it's something that NBC News Meet the Press covered in depth, and I will give you my commentary on that coverage after we watch Chuck Todd and a long introduction and then a long pre-recorded video package, but not about my main topic, the topic of guns, over here.
A good Sunday morning. The satirical website The Onion follows a ritual whenever there's a mass shooting in this country, running this headline. No way to prevent this, says only nation where this regularly happens. There's truth and humor, and in this case, it's a dark truth. Consider, March 16th, 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent, killed in and near Atlanta. March 17th, 5 shot in a drive-by shooting in Stockton, California. March 18th, 8 people shot in Gresham, Oregon, and New Orleans. March 20th, 2 killed, 17 wounded in mass shootings in Philadelphia, Dallas, and Houston. Monday, 13 killed, another 5 wounded in Boulder, Colorado, Detroit, and Cleveland. Tuesday, 2 killed, 6 wounded in Aliceville, Alabama, and Atlanta. Friday, 6 killed, 25 wounded in Chicago, Memphis, Philadelphia, and Virginia Beach. Yesterday, 1 killed, 13 wounded in River Grove, Illinois, Chicago, and Yazoo City, Mississippi. All that since the spa attacks. It was compiled by the nonprofit group Gun Violence Archive, which defines a mass shooting as 4 or more people being shot, not including the perpetrator. After a high-profile incident, U.S. politicians follow their own ritual. Democrats say enough is enough, time to get an assault weapons ban passed. Republicans say enough about gun control, this is a mental health problem, and we need to protect the Second Amendment. And what happens? Nothing gets done. For a year, we have been obsessed with a pandemic, and our medical system has done a brilliant job attacking that problem. But when it comes to our epidemic of gun violence, our political system has no answers.
Innocence is gone.
From Newtown
As a country, we have been through this too many times.
to Orlando,
So you just hear the bang, bang, bang.
And to actively do nothing is a decision as well.
to Sutherland Springs,
I personally have gotten a little tired of the statements following these tragedies that we need to do something.
to Parkland,
We want to send a message to these politicians that they cannot allow this to continue.
to Las Vegas,
We'll be talking about gun laws as time goes by.
to El Paso,
I think we can have some really meaningful background checks.
to Atlanta,
A white male? What is he wearing? I don't know. Please come, okay?
Women that look like me are constantly being attacked, we're being harassed, and now we're being killed.
to Boulder,
There's a shooter, active shooter. Get away. Get back.
There have been 2,805 mass shootings since the Gun Violence Archive began compiling data in 2014, and they have become more frequent. When it comes to considering tighter gun laws, the response by most Republicans in Washington has been a never-ending cycle of wash, rinse, repeat.
Unfortunately, in Washington, emotion, I think, often leads to bad policies.
We need to really focus on the facts before we take hard positions.
This is not the time to jump to some conclusion, not knowing the full facts.
In 2004, the 1994 assault weapons ban was allowed to expire. And even after a mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut left 20 first graders dead, President Obama was unable to win passage of tighter gun restrictions.
The yeas are 54, the nays are 46.
All in all, this was a pretty shameful day for Washington.
That's despite growing support for some gun restrictions. In an NBC News Wall Street Journal poll conducted in 2019, after mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton, 89% supported expanding background checks to all gun sales and transfers. 76% supported red flag laws to help law enforcement remove guns from those posing as an imminent danger to themselves or others. 75% supported a voluntary gun buyback program. 62% supported banning assault weapons. The House passed 2 bills this month, extending background checks to most private gun sales and lengthening the time the FBI has to complete a background check to a minimum of 10 days.
The United States Senate, I hope some are listening, should immediately pass the 2 House-passed bills that close loopholes in the background check system.
61% of Americans say they want the Senate to pass the House bills, though Republicans whose support for gun restrictions has eroded are evenly split.
The legislative solutions have been perplexing, and as I said, I share Joe Manchin's opposition to the version that passed in the House.
Still, Democratic leader Chuck Schumer promised this week to bring that bill to the floor.
This is a different Senate. We are going to debate, and everyone's going to have to vote.
Well, joining me now is Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who has been designated as the point person for Senate Democrats.
So, yeah, that was the news summary I talked about before I showed it. Senator Chris Murphy, I'm not going to have a clip from him. Pat Toomey comes later. One interesting thing that Senator Chris Murphy talked about was that the fact that Democrats are threatening to get rid of the filibuster puts Republicans in a position where they want to show that the Senate can actually do things without getting rid of the filibuster. So there may be a way to get, the most incremental gun control legislation passed, like not the full bills that Biden was talking about wanting the Senate to pass in the Biden clip they showed in that news summary. But you saw McConnell, Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader, thank God for the elections in Georgia that made Senator Mitch McConnell the Senate minority, not majority leader. He didn't say that he opposed background checks. I can't remember who said this in the pundit discussion, but you saw it in the clip there, Mitch McConnell saying he opposed the version passed by the House. And the thing Chris Murphy pointed out is because Republicans want to show that the Senate can do things, Mitch McConnell may go along with some version of background checks, which is really popular with the American people. So that's something to think about. A couple other things I wanted to mention about that news summary. It was a kind of a brave move to start a mass shooting news summary with an article from The Onion, but it was appropriate. I think it was G. Wolf in the live comments saying that The Onion's been right for years or something like that, which is true. Although one thing Chuck Todd said in the introduction there was that we responded so well to the COVID epidemic, but we can't respond to the epidemic of shootings. And I'm not sure I buy that premise. One of the things I'm not showing from CNN's State of the Union, they talked about this special they're doing sometime tonight, I think, a CNN special report about how, hundreds of thousands more people died than had to die in the United States because of bad governmental decision-making by the prior presidential administration. And they even had a little clip of Deborah Birx talking about how she got yelled at by Trump for saying last August that COVID was widespread and dangerous to the rural areas. And anyway, so that's not something I'm showing from CNN, but it kind of contradicts Chuck Todd's commentary there about how well we responded to the COVID-19 epidemic. I'm not sure we did it that much better than we've responded to the epidemic of shootings, mass shootings, or, something about the United States. I don't know, maybe it's a bunch of factors that make that Onion article true, that, nothing can be done about shootings, say people in country, only country where this ever happens, or whatever. Well, you saw. I don't know, I had to repeat it, but like I said, bold move by Chuck Todd and NBC News' Meet the Press by starting with political comedy in the mass shooting topic. The next news summary I'm going to show you is just a little bit shorter. It's ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Jonathan Karl. And you'll see it does talk about the shootings. It talks about Joe Biden's first press conference, presser as they call it, last Thursday, and how Biden has certain priorities. This actually, a couple of the news summaries mentioned this, how Biden has priorities, but the news may stop those priorities from happening. You remember from last week, ABC was very quick to blame Biden for the so-called border crisis. Although, as I was saying last week, calling it a border crisis is really talking about a symptom. It's like, the zombie apocalypse happens, and you notice a whole bunch of people are like knocking on your door, yelling, "Help! Help! Help us!" And you call it like it's a door-knocking crisis. No, it's a zombie apocalypse is the crisis, not the people knocking on the door because of the zombie apocalypse. Or anyway, that's just my opinion, but not so much the ABC opinion, which I will talk about with you a little more after you see. Oh, and this ends with a clip of Lindsey Graham, who I mentioned I'll be showing a more extended interview clip from later. But here's the ABC News Summary I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. President Biden's first press conference was a reminder of just how much has changed since his predecessor left the White House. Biden, who waited more than 2 months to have his first press conference, seems to want his policies to take center stage, not himself. And that may be the most profound difference between the 45th and 46th presidents. Perhaps it's not surprising, then, that public opinion on Biden's work so far varies dramatically depending on the issue. In a new ABC News Ipsos poll out this morning, Biden has a sky-high approval rating when it comes to his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine distribution, and economic recovery. But when it comes to his handling of gun violence and the situation at the border with Mexico, most Americans don't approve. In other words, President Biden is off to a good start on issues where he has been able to set the agenda, but not so much on issues where the real world has interfered.
Successful electoral politics is the art of the possible.
The art of the possible, but the Biden agenda is ambitious, aiming at as big an expansion of government as anything since LBJ's Great Society. Although in his first presidential press conference, President Biden sought to downplay expectations.
Successful presidents, better than me, have been successful in large part because they know how to time what they're doing. Order it. Decide on priorities.
His first priority was COVID relief. Next up, something bigger.
Rebuild the infrastructure, both physical and technological infrastructure of this country.
But as just about every president learns...
Tonight, breaking news as we come on the air, a gunman opening fire at a grocery store.
The real world imposes its own priorities. With mass shootings in Atlanta and Colorado, pressure yet again to act on gun safety and mental health. Missile launches and more threats from North Korea. And at the border, a massive influx of children and families, and a system simply unable to deal with it. On Mexico's border with California, some migrants have worn T-shirts saying, "Biden, please let us in." Others have said they are coming because that is exactly what they expect the new president to do.
That's the reason why it's happening, that I'm a decent man, or however it's phrased, that, that's why they're coming, because Biden's a good guy. Truth of the matter is, nothing has changed.
While surges this time of year are common and the president has said migrants should not make the dangerous journey, much has changed. We are now seeing record numbers of unaccompanied children crossing the border. There are now more than 18,000 unaccompanied minors in U.S. custody. ABC's Cecilia Vega met 9-year-old Joselle after he took the treacherous journey from Honduras without his parents.
So, sir, you blame the last administration, but is your messaging in saying that these children are and will be allowed to stay in this country and work their way through this process, encouraging families like Joselle's to come?
The idea that I'm going to say, which I would never do, that if an unaccompanied child ends up at the border, we're just going to let him starve to death and stay on the other side. No previous administration did that either, except Trump. I'm not going to do it.
Visiting the border this week, a group of Republican senators told our Rachel Scott the children should be sent back home.
We just met a mother.
Yes.
With her 5-year-old.
Yeah.
She was in tears.
Yeah.
Crossing the border. What do? Do you send that mother and her 5-year-old child back across the border?
Yes,
they should go back across the border after making this trek here, looking for a better life, looking for asylum.
There's a legal way to get here and there's an illegal way to get here. I don't blame them, I blame us.
The Biden administration has refused to allow journalists to see inside the most crowded facilities housing migrants at the border.
Will you commit to transparency on this issue?
I will commit to transparency. And as soon as I am in a position to be able to implement what we're doing right now.
But the Republican senators did get a look inside, and they released their own images. Overcrowded under any circumstances, especially during a pandemic.
Can you describe for us what you saw?
I think the most striking was the Donna facility. Literally side by side, children who are lying down on the floor. They don't have beds. They're lying down on the floor. They're right next to each other. They're touching each other.
A lot to cover this morning with our first guest, White House Communications Director Kate Bedingfield. Kate, thank you.
And I don't have a clip from Kate Bedingfield. And also, I apologize. I said it ended with a clip of Lindsey Graham, and there was a Lindsey Graham clip in there, but I didn't give you a trigger warning that there was going to be some Ted Cruz there at the end. But a lot of people were making fun of Ted Cruz, like hiding in the bushes in the dark by the Rio Grande River as part of this whole Republican trip to the border, which is just trying to publicize this crisis and blame it on Biden. I talked about that a lot last week, so I don't want to go into it so much this week. But I mentioned that I think it's not quite the most accurate framing of the actual crisis before I showed the clip. The next news, and you'll see it in the Fox News summary, also some of the same framing, but the next news summary is actually from CBS News Face the Nation, and it is on what may be the biggest story that I was talking about this at the beginning of the program, about the Dr. Anthony Fauci clip I'll be showing at the end, also from CBS News Face the Nation. You know, a few weeks ago, Dr. Fauci was warning that we were plateauing. You know, cases have been coming down, deaths have been coming down, people are getting vaccinated, people are starting to be hopeful, but I think people are relaxing too soon. I've seen a lot of it in my local area, and you'll see there in this news summary, CBS News was the first to cover COVID before anyone even knew it was a big story. I've sometimes said they should be the COVID broadcasting system, or coronavirus broadcasting system. CBS should stand for, because they've done the most in-depth coverage, and you'll see it here with Margaret, Brennan, and Mark Strassman. They kind of get into some of the other issues briefly, but it's all in the framework of COVID, and we could be in big trouble, both because of variants and because of like the spring break and Passover, Easter gatherings, and TSA numbers. People traveling are disturbing. Anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that news summary together over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. This weekend, the race to vaccinate America marks a new milestone. The daily number of doses administered is at a record level. Despite that ramp up in vaccinations, infections are also on the rise in 30 states plus Washington, D.C. We begin with senior national correspondent Mark Strassman.
COVID immunity.
To these California seniors, it's a shot of liberation in this season of renewal.
It gives you a feeling of normalcy again.
On Saturday alone, nearly 3.5 million Americans got the COVID vaccine, a single-day record. Across the country, more than 50 million adults, roughly 1 in 5, now fully vaccinated. Clearly, it's progress. Now, here comes the disclaimer.
Too many people feel like the pandemic is over.
Immunologists worry with the vaccine, we're confusing immunity with invulnerability. TSA agents now screen more than 1 million flyers every day, including many returning spring breakers.
Watch out for Miami Beach. Get tested before you come back.
In Michigan, new cases over the last week jumped more than 50% and climbed generally in New England and the Great Lakes region, where it's colder. Despite pleas from health officials, 17 states now don't have masking requirements, even though the virus still kills roughly 1,000 more Americans every day.
I remain deeply concerned about this trajectory. Please take this moment very seriously.
COVID also complicates the U.S. response along the Mexican border. The daily surge of more Central American arrivals, refugees from squalor and gun violence. A 9-year-old girl drowned last week trying to cross into Texas.
We also saw a group of children who just today tested positive for COVID-19.
Images from congressmen show overcrowded border crossings. Packed facilities are challenged by COVID protocols. Unaccompanied children are allowed to stay, and hundreds have tested positive. FEMA's helping put up more temporary housing. Bob Fenton talked to us about the challenge.
So we have to find the right facility. We need to have the staffing for this facility, be able to feed, take care of them, and provide the wraparound care services for them.
Officially, the Biden administration won't label its struggle to control the border a crisis. But no question, COVID remains a continuing one in America. At mass vaccination sites like this one at Delta headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia this week became the 6th state to offer shots to anyone aged 16 and up. Universal eligibility, all adults, that is the goal. And more than 40 states have committed to it by May 1st. Margaret?
Mark Strassman, thank you. We go now to the president's chief medical advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci.
And as I told you earlier, that'll be my last news clip. Clip number 11 is Dr. Anthony Fauci talking about the upsurge in COVID cases, which was covered really well by CBS. And they even covered like the border crisis through the framework of COVID you saw there. And Mark Strassman did it all from Atlanta. Again, why is Mark Strassman still in Atlanta? They never explained that one. That's something I want to hear about. And then I was reading the live comments along the way. I saw a lot of people were talking about where they were in their vaccinations. I saw Cage say I got my second dose Tuesday. Schmoab said I got shot 1 Wednesday. G-Wolf, 12 days till my second one. Last week I told you that I had, I got my shot. Tomorrow will be 2 weeks, so I'm 8 days from my second Pfizer vaccine, and I recommend everyone get vaccinated. It's the smart thing to do. It's the socially responsible thing to do. Everybody's doing it. You should do it too. That's my PSA, I guess, for vaccination after watching that. And I want to move on now to the Fox News Sunday news summary, which actually covers a lot of the same things. It also mentions it's Infrastructure Week. That was like a big joke during the Trump administration, but it's kind of like the ABC news summary I showed earlier, talking about how Biden has his priorities. I think it even starts with Biden has COVID-19 as his priority, but the news is giving him gun rights and the border. They call it a border crisis, of course, on Fox News, and the gun issue, the voting rights issue, and it's all mixed in here with Infrastructure Week from Chris Wallace and Mark Meredith at the beginning of Fox News Sunday this morning over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington.
Joe Biden talked at his press conference this week about how successful presidents know how to roll out their agenda, to prioritize what issues to push and in what order. That's what he's tried to do his first 2 months in office, keep the focus on the pandemic, both the public health crisis and the impact on the economy. But now other issues are demanding attention. The crisis at the border, 2 mass shootings, and the battle over voting rights. And like all presidents, Mr. Biden has to respond. In a moment, we'll sit down with White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. But first, let's turn to Mark Meredith, traveling with the president in Wilmington, Delaware. Mark.
Chris, this week, President Biden will lay out a new economic agenda for the country with a major focus expected to be on infrastructure. But the White House faces plenty of other issues which have the potential to derail the president's plans.
President Biden will travel to Pittsburgh Wednesday to urge lawmakers to spend trillions of dollars rebuilding America's roads, bridges, and airports.
We rank 13th globally in infrastructure. China is investing 3 times more in infrastructure than the United States is.
To pay for his plans, the president is expected to call for tax hikes on corporations and wealthier Americans. Republicans are already revolting.
They should call this the grab your wallet bill, or this is going to be the raise your taxes bill.
Instead of infrastructure, some lawmakers want the president to spend more time focusing on the border, where a surge of migrants is overwhelming government resources.
They need to come down here, they need to listen, and they need to learn.
The White House says it's working on a better border strategy, the president tasking the vice president to lead the effort.
Thank you, Mr. President, and for having the confidence in me. And there's no question that this is a challenging situation.
But more challenges remain ahead. Many parents are fed up with continuing school closures. North Korea is testing more rockets, and the gun control debate is back after deadly massacres in Georgia and Colorado.
One bright spot, the administration is doubling its goal for the rollout of the coronavirus vaccine. It now hopes to have 200 million doses distributed by the end of April, right around the time the president is set to mark 100 days in office. Chris.
Mark Meredith reporting from Delaware. Mark, thank you. And joining us now, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. Jen.
I don't have a Jen Psaki clip, although there is a link down in the video description to watch Fox News Sunday. Or to watch all the shows I take my clips from if you want to watch the whole thing. I pretty much pre-criticized that news summary before I showed it. The final news summary that I'm going to show you is the shortest one from CNN State of the Union. Dana Bash. I don't know, I guess today's Palm Sunday and then next Sunday's Easter, which is, is that why, or maybe just because of spring, that the State of the Union this week is hoping for renewal. You know, they always start off the show State of the Union saying what is the State of the Union this week, and then you'll see coverage of kind of the same thing, Biden's priorities from the press conference, but then urgent and breaking topics like gun rights, immigration, and of course voting rights, which is something that CNN State of the Union also focuses on, gives you some idea of what's wrong with the Georgia voter suppression law and some of the other voter suppression things going on, and legislation in Congress to solve all that. In the briefest of the news summaries, I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Hello, I'm Dana Bash in Washington, where the State of our Union is ready for renewal. After the momentum of his first weeks in office, President Biden is now facing several urgent national crises: immigration, gun control, and voting rights, and the reality of limited options to bring about the sweeping change he wants. This week, the assault on voting rights took on a new urgency as Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp signed a new law Thursday, making it more difficult for thousands of Georgians to vote. The law imposes a new voter identification requirement, several of them for absentee ballots, empowers state officials to take over local elections boards, limits the use of ballot drop boxes, and makes it a crime to approach voters in line to give them food or water. In his first solo press conference since taking office, President Biden assailed the efforts by Republicans across the country to restrict voting as, quote, sick and un-American, and said Friday the Justice Department is taking a look at the measure. But with such a narrow majority in the U.S. Senate, the options for Democrats to take legislative action on voting rights are realistically slim. I want to note we invited Georgia's Governor Brian Kemp to join us this morning, and his office did not respond to our request. Joining me now is Democratic Georgia Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock.
So, and I will have an extended clip of Raphael Warnock talking about Georgia's voter suppression law and also whether there should be corporate boycotts because of it. And I have an interesting thing that I wanted to talk about based on something I saw on Twitter as to one specific Georgia corporation that could do something about the Georgia voter suppression law. I did want to thank the people who gave extra support to my YouTube channel. I saw Karl became a new member, I think maybe a rejoined member by clicking that join button below the video, and then Lulu Girl with a nice contribution, saying that she heard I had a birthday this week. That's true, I did have a birthday this week, and thanking me for the sardine clip with Dash, and also the bacon for Sandy. Don't forget the bacon for Sandy. Yeah, that was the big sardine for Dash and bacon for Sandy clip last week. I have a much briefer Dash and Sandy or Dandy clip at the end of the show tonight, but I just wanted to stop briefly and thank those two people for going the extra distance to support my channel, other than giving me a thumbs up and subscribing and posting the supportive comments. There are links down in the video description for the Patreon support, the PayPal support, and anyway, I just wanted to end the news summaries with that, although this next clip is it's not a news summary, it's something they do on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. No, I'm sorry. I got the wrong one. This is from, I was right. It's from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. I don't know why I didn't trust my own memory, but they often have Nate Silver on to talk about, whether you should believe certain things, and this is about the voter suppression laws. They start off with Brian Kemp and Raphael Warnock, clips of both. Brian Kemp is the governor of Georgia who signed this voter suppression law, and then Raphael Warnock is the new senator from Georgia who I'm going to have an extended clip talking about this voter suppression law coming up. But then you'll see Nate Silver give an interesting analysis of, everyone says that Republicans benefit from these laws that suppress turnout, and Democrats benefit when there's a greater turnout, and you'll see here Nate Silver is going to quantify that, but saying that I'll wait till afterwards to repeat one of the important points he makes about data about the past after we watch that clip together over here.
With Senate Bill 202, Georgia will take another step toward ensuring our elections are secure, accessible, and fair. Ensuring the integrity of the ballot box isn't partisan. It's about protecting the very foundation of who we are as Georgians and Americans.
Either we're a democracy or we're not. Either we believe in the idea of one person, one vote, or we don't. Either I'm a citizen or I'm not.
Dueling reactions to Georgia's new voting law comes in the wake of a presidential election that saw the largest turnout in more than a century. But after then President Trump spent months making false claims of election fraud, Republican lawmakers across the country are now rushing to enact new restrictions on voting. 538's Nate Silver analyzes the potential impact.
There's a reason why historically Republicans have tried to make it harder for people to vote. Looking at changes in state voting laws since the 1990s, our research at 538 found that in general, when voting laws are eased, it tends to help Democrats, and when they're restricted, it tends to help Republicans. Based on the historical data, imposing a sweeping set of new restrictions might help a Republican candidate by as much as 2 to 3 percentage points in forthcoming elections. That's significant given how close many elections are these days. But as they warn you when you're buying stocks, past performance is no guarantee of future results. That might also be the case when it comes to voting laws. Here's why. Before Trump, the GOP tended to win the votes of so-called high-propensity voters, meaning people who voted in nearly every election. These voters tended to be suburban and college-educated. But lately, those voters have been leaning more Democratic, especially in states like Georgia, where Joe Biden beat Trump by 15 points among college grads. So we can no longer assume lower turnout always helps the GOP. In the Georgia Senate runoff, where turnout was 10% lower than in November, Democratic performance actually improved. Meanwhile, Republicans are trying to reduce mail voting in several states. But while Democrats were more likely to vote by mail in 2020, that was a new, maybe COVID-related phenomenon. In Florida, for example, mail voting had historically been a program that Republican voters took more advantage of. With that said, I don't want to take this too far. A lot of the GOP changes are aimed at hampering turnout among black voters by limiting programs like Souls to the Polls. So high bias will probably make life harder for Democrats, but there's a chance it could backfire.
Thanks, Nate. Now let's get to our roundtable. Former Chicago mayor.
And yeah, the chance that, well, one of the things he said, like investments, past performance doesn't necessarily predict future results. And one thing I've noticed about voter suppression laws is the more they're in the news, the more they do backfire, because people don't like to hear that someone's trying to stop them from voting, and that gives people the motivation to stand in those long lines. Although the motivation to stand in those long lines might be cut by this new Georgia voter suppression law that says you can't give people food or water even though they're standing in those lines for hours and hours. And anyway, I have 4 newsmaker clips, 3 on this new Jim Crow in Georgia topic. First, Raphael Warnock. Almost 6 minutes of Raphael Warnock that's going to have to get you through over 6 minutes of a combination of Lindsey Graham and Pat Toomey. And then I'll finish up the show with Anthony Fauci warning about the uptick in COVID cases in the United States. But the Raphael Warnock clip here, like I said, starts with a long description of the problems with the Georgia voter suppression law and ends with, I've edited that clip together with a clip from later in the interview where he talks about corporate boycotts, because I have something extra to say about corporate boycotts after we watch the Raphael Warnock clip together over here.
I want to put up that picture of Governor Brian Kemp signing this law in a room full of white men. And here's what he had to say about the law shortly before that ceremony.
So we're actually expanding the right to vote in Georgia. Now, you're not hearing that from the other side, but that's what the truth is. So we're securing the vote. I think most people want that, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or somewhere in between. Everybody wants to have confidence in the elections. I believe that's what we're doing in Georgia.
What's your response to that, sir?
He knows better. And unfortunately, Georgia has a long history of voter suppression. And when I say a long history, I mean in recent years. And certainly it has ramped up with this bill that he signed into law the other night, as you pointed out, in the presence of all white men. And on the other side was a state legislator elected by her people to represent them. And she was lightly knocking on the door and was arrested and charged with 2 felonies. Georgia needs to understand, that is, those in the state legislature, the governor, that it wasn't just this state legislator who's a member of my church, and I went to see about her that night. She's not the only one knocking at that door. The people are knocking at the door of their democracy, and they will not be denied. They're raising their voices. I'm going to do everything I can to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act so that we can expand our democracy rather than contract it. The governor is taking us back. We intend to go forward.
And I want to ask about that legislation in a moment. But first, you are the first black man from Georgia and the first black Democrat from a former Confederate state ever elected to the U.S. Senate. You have to run again next year to keep your seat. Do you think this law restricting voting rights in your state is a backlash to your election specifically?
Well, I am very clear that this is not about me. This is really about preserving the voices of the people in their democracy. And I honestly think, Dana, that politicians focused on their own political ambition is what's gotten us here in the first place. Yeah. You have legislators who are running scared. And so rather than having the people select their politicians, the politicians are trying to cherry pick their voters. This is an assault on the covenant that we have with one another as an American people, and it's my job to protect it.
And I understand what you mean. I guess maybe the question isn't about you personally, but about what you represent.
Oh, I think, we've seen this over the history of our country. Our democracy expands and it contracts. We have this amazing idea, when you think about the long march of human history, this experiment in self-government, one person, one vote. And it was stated in the charter documents of our nation, but we've always had to fight for it. When Jefferson offered up those ideals that all men are created equal, I guess he meant all men because women weren't included. People of color, black people have had to fight for their vote. And honestly, it is disconcerting that here we are again, fighting for what's basic, but we will not be worn down. We intend to stand up to this moment. And I think it's important that people understand that while race certainly is a part of this equation, and young people and others are being marginalized, at the end of the day, this is about our democracy. This is about the covenant we have with one another as an American people. We have big arguments in our country about the direction, about the things that we need to do. But at the end of the day, the four most powerful words in a democracy are the people have spoken. And we cannot allow politicians to silence the people, crowd them out of their own democracy.
Georgia-based corporations like Coca-Cola and Delta are facing intense criticism for not doing more to publicly oppose this law. Organizations like the PGA, the MLB are also under pressure to move high-profile events like the Masters and the All-Star Game out of your state of Georgia. Does corporate America need to be more forceful in denouncing this law? Should boycotts be on the table?
I think we all have to use our voices. And I have to tell you, as the pastor of Ebenezer Church, I've seen these corporations falling over themselves every year around the time of the King holiday, celebrating Dr. King. And yes, I think that the way to celebrate Dr. King is to stand up for what he represented, voting rights. And so we will see how all of that plays out. But I'm focused on what we can do in the United States Senate. We have a responsibility to make sure that we secure the franchise. And when we do that, we protect the democracy. And I think also we set the climate for business. We want to see people prosper, particularly who have been suffering for months under this pandemic. We need to pass this legislation, protect the right of the people to be heard in their own democracy, and to make sure that Georgia is open for business and open for voting.
So no boycotts?
Listen, I'm not focused on that. I am focused on what I can do as a United States Senator.
So I really enjoyed the stuff Raphael Warnock said about the history and recent history of voter suppression in Georgia, about his congregant, who was a legislator who was arrested and charged with felonies for nothing, as far, knocking on the governor's door, and when he was signing this voter suppression bill with 6 white men and a picture of a plantation in the background, and all of that was really worthwhile covering. But the boycott thing, one of the things that made me think about, they're talking about prominent Atlanta corporations and what kind of boycotts they should do. One of the most prominent pieces of this legislation in terms of getting negative coverage is the prohibition against giving water to people standing in line for hours to vote. And that's probably unconstitutional according to Lawrence Tribe. I did see on Twitter and saw it was Lawrence Tribe, who you may recall, this is my book, American Constitutional Law, written by Lawrence Tribe. So he wrote this big book. He must know what he's talking about. Well, anyway, you can decide for yourself. I've actually read this book, and it is a good book on constitutional law. And I saw someone else on Twitter, and I can't remember who it was. I'm sorry about that. I wish I could give credit for this idea, but it was like a sort of like sarcastic thing. I wonder if there's some company in Georgia that has a lot of drinks that they could give out, that and they're so big that if they got prosecuted for violating this law, it would really hurt Georgia. What company could, it's of course Coca-Cola, and I think they own Dasani water, and so that actually is what I think people should be, instead of the whole boycott thing, people should be like writing in and starting petitions asking Coca-Cola to like give out a free bottle of Dasani water to everyone waiting in line in Georgia in the next election. And so, like, if the Georgia Republicans want to come after someone, they can come after the Coca-Cola Corporation, and they certainly have the legal talent to fight that particular criminal charge. And actually, corporations can be charged with crimes, and I don't know, that would be some good corporate citizenship by Coca-Cola. So I just wanted to mention that in connection with the Raphael Warnock clip. And I told you the almost 6 minutes there of Raphael Warnock are going to have to get you through 2 Republican senators. And the worst one, of course, Lindsey Graham, talking about playing the race card. And I think this is one of those little jiu-jitsu moves where it's actually Lindsey Graham playing the race card by claiming other people are playing the race card. But anyway, I'll talk with you a little more about that after we watch Senator Lindsey Graham together over here.
Senator, I want to change subjects with you on you. President Biden has come down hard on Republican legislators in traditionally red states voting to restrict voting rights. Take a look at what he said in his news conference.
What I'm worried about is how un-American this whole initiative is. It's sick. It's sick.
Senator, are Republicans going too far in some of these various states?
You know what's sick is have the President of the United States to play the race card continuously in such a hypocritical way. He said the filibuster was a relic of the Jim Crow era. Well, he made an hour speech when he was a senator suggesting the filibuster was the best thing for the Senate to make it different than the House. This is a letter signed by 61 senators in 2017 when we had the House, the Senate, and the White House, 27 Democrats saying, please keep in place the filibuster. What's sick is H.R. 1. Federalizing state elections. In our Constitution, states supposed to run elections. H.R. 1 is the biggest power grab in the history of the country. It institutionalizes ballot harvesting. It does away with the voter ID requirement. It will take over every election in every state. It makes the Federal Election Commission a partisan commission. It will no longer be bipartisan. So that's the power grab we're standing up to. To my friends in Georgia, they had the highest turnout in the history of Georgia. We had 150-something million people vote. So every time a Republican does anything, we're a racist. If you're a white conservative, you're a racist. If you're a black Republican, you're either Prop or Uncle Tom. They use the racism card to advance a liberal agenda, and we're tired of it. H.R. 1 is sick, not what they're doing in Georgia.
All right, well, let's take a look at some of the provisions in Georgia, and these are specific ones that a lot of people are having heartburn about, Senator. It would limit the number and location of drop boxes. It allows counties to cut off early voting at 5 p.m. before a lot of working people get off and could go vote. And this is the one that I think is creating the biggest fuss. It prohibits, it makes it a crime to give food or drink to voters waiting in line. Senator, why on earth, if Americans are willing to wait in hours to vote, would you make it a crime for people to come and give them a bottle of water?
Well, all I can say is that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I agree with you there. But in Georgia, you had an explosion of mail-in balloting. The Carter-Baker Commission in 2005 looked at our election system and they had 2 warnings for us. Absentee mail voting is ripe for fraud, and ballot harvesting, where an individual can collect ballots on behalf of other people, is a threat to democracy as we know it. Both of those provisions are in H.R. 1. So if you don't like what they're doing in Georgia, you can go to court and stop them. But what they're doing with H.R. 1 is destroying destroying the ability of any state to run elections, doing away with voter ID, changing the Federal Election Commission to make it partisan, and institutionalizing national ballot harvesting, which would be a disaster to our elections.
New subject.
Well, I've worked as an activist and worked during elections, and that whole ballot harvesting thing, that just means that people can, you have your list of people who are absentee ballot voters, and you've talked to them about the issues, and then when it comes to the last few weeks before the election, you call, instead of them having to go out and mail their ballots or drop it off, you can go and you can collect them, and that makes it even easier for people to vote. And why it is that Republicans are against making it easier for people to vote, that all of that rhetoric, some of this other stuff in there, at least Lindsey Graham couldn't explain why you shouldn't be able to give water to people in line, but he didn't address the closing the polls at 5 p.m. That is obviously discriminatory against working people, and they didn't even address that thing I told you about before at the beginning of the show, where now the state legislature can overrule the county board of elections when they certify the vote. So they can say, oh, Fulton County, Georgia, run by Democrats, we don't like the way you counted your votes. We're going to certify them ourselves as Republicans who control the Georgia state legislature. That's not right, and that wasn't addressed there. But I want to contrast what you just saw from Lindsey Graham with Senator Pat Toomey, a supposed moderate Republican, and it's still I think someone in the live comments was saying it's the old "I'm not a racist, you're a racist" argument, or like, I know you are, but what am I? Or you can't play the race card because I play the race card. And it's kind of ridiculous, but it's also, like I said at the beginning of the show, Pat Toomey is just sort of like Lindsey Graham light. All of the Republican Party is using these same talking points, and I will talk about that a little more after we watch this last newsmaker clip in the new Jim Crow in Georgia topic together over here.
One last question. I want to ask you about the voting rights issue, but I want to play a statement from your colleague on the Democratic side of the aisle, Raphael Warnock. Here's what he had to say about voting rights.
We wouldn't have to have this debate about the filibuster, at least on this issue, if the folks on the other side would do the right thing and stand for voting rights.
I want to separate out H.R. 1 from the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Do you believe there are 10 Republicans to do an updated version of the Voting Rights Act, something that used to be fairly easy to get done in a bipartisan way? I know the issues with H.R. 1, and I'm trying to separate the two. Where are you on this?
So I haven't drilled down on this distinction that you're making. The Democrats have been driving this message on H.R. 1, and I think we ought to be asking our Democratic colleagues, why are they so insistent that we not have any mechanism to verify that a person seeking to vote is in fact the person that they say they are? Why are they so insistent that people ought to be able to go ballot harvesting, maybe go through a nursing home and get a couple of hundred ballots that just happen to be whatever they are? I mean, there is a completely false narrative about so-called voter suppression. You look at the Georgia law. There's no voter suppression. Sunday voting is still allowed. There's an expansion of in-person voting. There's no requirement that you have a reason for a mail-in ballot. All you need is some verification of ID, and so does every Department of Transportation in America in order to drive. So does every airline if you're going to get on a plane. So this has been a false narrative entirely, Chuck, and I'm afraid it's all about trying to get rid of the filibuster. We're not going to be cowed by being called racist over policy that has nothing to do with race.
I understand your point of view there. I'm just curious, though, do you think it's a good look for the party that after a presidential loss, after the former candidate basically creates a false narrative and lies about why it happened, that these laws are getting changed under a false pretense? That's not a good look for the Republican Party, is it not?
Well, Chuck, look, I was very critical of President Trump along the way after the election, as I think you know, but we should be honest about this. We made very dramatic, sweeping changes to accommodate the circumstances of a global pandemic that had huge implications. And some of those sweeping changes include provisions that are really actually tough to verify the accuracy of the vote, and we have an awful lot of Americans who are worried about the integrity of our system. So some common sense measures like requiring an ID to get an absentee ballot or to vote, that just makes a lot of sense.
Senator Pat Toomey, Republican from Pennsylvania. Always appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective.
So, like I said, before I showed the clip, Pat Toomey was sort of the light version of Lindsey Graham, although I guess the race card he was trying to throw back at the Democrats was the relic of Jim Crow, the filibuster being the relic of Jim Crow. That was what Michael Che was talking about in my political comedy clip at the beginning, and I talked about that also, how it can't be a relic of Jim Crow since it predates Jim Crow, but it definitely has a Jim Crow history, and the thing is, it's actually mostly a Democratic Jim Crow history, because before the big realignment around LBJ and the Civil Rights Acts, before that, when the Northern Republicans and the Western the non-Southern Democrats came together to pass civil rights legislation, and LBJ said that the Democrats would lose the South for a generation, and it's actually been at least that long. That's when all it used to be the Democrats had all the racist people in the South, and that's when they all started shifting to the Republican Party. There was Reagan's Southern strategy. This is actually something they talk that Micheal Alexander talks about in the new Jim Crow here, but there were Democrats, Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond, Robert Byrd from West Virginia was a member of the Ku Klux Klan at one point, and he was a elder Democrat, and on Fox News they keep talking about, when the filibuster comes up, how Joe Biden said nice things about Robert Byrd at his funeral, the former Ku Klux Klan guy, although he later in life totally repudiated that, of course. But anyway, I didn't want to give the totally partisan version of the racist history of Jim Crow without mentioning the role Democrats played in it. And actually, if you read The New Jim Crow by Micheal Alexander, you'll see how Democrats also participated in the creation of mass incarceration, the 94 crime bill that Joe Biden helped author in the Senate, and then he has now later repudiated. There's all sorts of ways that Democrats were complicit in racist policies, and the old Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow. So I didn't want to finish the topic without mentioning that. And so finally, I'm getting to the COVID-19 topic. I mentioned that this would just be one brief clip. Well, you saw the CBS News Face the Nation news summary about how people are relaxing too soon and there's a possible uptick. This is Dr. Anthony Fauci warns of increase in COVID cases. You'll see Margaret Brennan, also on CBS News' Face the Nation here, asks Anthony Fauci if this uptick is due to variants. I think during the live comments last week, someone was asking me to explain variants again. Well, COVID-19 is a virus. Viruses are very simple organisms. Some people say they're not even alive, but they are. They don't even have DNA. They have RNA. And one of the ways that our immune system recognizes COVID-19 is you've seen pictures with the spikes on the outside. Well, those spikes are made of proteins, and that's what our antibodies are reacting to, and that's what the vaccines are meant to make our body create antibodies to fight those spiky proteins. But the more COVID-19 spreads, the more it mutates. The RNA that tells the virus how to create its own proteins or whatever, it changes. And if those spiky proteins change, then people who've had COVID-19 before, their antibodies no longer protect them because it doesn't recognize the spiky proteins, or people who've been vaccinated might not have as much immunity. That's what, the variants, every time it goes through a person, every time it replicates, there are changes in the RNA, mutations, and anyway, that's not really why there's been an uptick. It might be a factor according to Anthony Fauci, but it's really the spring break, the traveling, the people who are just relaxing too soon, the getting rid of the mask mandates, like I talked about in the last few weeks, and that's the final newsmaker clip that we can watch together over here.
You have been warning all month that we are stuck. We are plateauing at a high level of infection. You just heard that. Michigan, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, we're seeing spikes. What's driving these infections? Is it the new variants?
Well, the variants are playing a part, but it is not completely the variants. What we're likely seeing is because of things like spring break and pulling back on the mitigation methods that you've seen now. Several states have done that. I believe it's premature, Margaret, because when I've said many times to you that when you're coming down from a big peak and you reach a point and start to plateau, once you stay at that plateau, you're really in danger of a surge coming up. And unfortunately, that's what we're starting to see. We got stuck at around 50,000 new cases per day, went up to 60,000 the other day, and that's really a risk. We've seen that in our own country, and that's exactly what's happened in Europe, in several of the countries in the European Union, where they plateaued and then started to come back. And that's why we say it really is almost a race between getting people vaccinated and having this peak that we may want to see, and we don't want to see that. And again, it isn't just the variants. Variants we take seriously and are concerned, but it is not only the variants that are doing that.
The CDC director said this week it is not the time to travel. What specifically is the problem with travel?
Well, when you see travel, and what Dr. Walensky was referring to is that whenever we see surges in travel, be that around the holidays or around certain situations like we did over the Christmas and New Year's holiday and other types of holidays, you get congregation of people. Even if on the planes people are wearing masks, when you get to the airport, the check-in lines, the food lines for restaurants, the boarding that you see, how people sometimes can be congregating together, those are the kind of things that invariably increase the risk of getting infected. That's what she was referring to. The travel phenomenon in general does that.
It's still high risk then. So when you were last with us...
Yeah, it is.
He said, yeah, it is at the end. Still high risk. I kind of cut that off, but that was the last newsmaker clip. That, as I've pointed out most weeks, at the link down in the video description for CBS News Face the Nation, pretty much the entire show is split up into segments on the CBS News Face the Nation YouTube channel, so you can watch it for free. And they actually reported on the spread around. Elizabeth Palmer from London talked about the spread around the world, how there are upticks in or surges of coronavirus cases, especially in Brazil. Things are really bad in Brazil, but all around the world. Even in Israel, there are some problems, despite their high vaccination rates. So I recommend, if you want the best COVID coverage, to watch that. But anyway, that is the last of the news clips. I hope you appreciate the 8 to 10 hours I spent every Sunday for almost, like I said, 2 weeks from now will be the 8-year anniversary of Liberal Viewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. So it's 8 years of every Sunday, spending my Sundays picking out the clips, adding my commentary and criticism, watching your live comments, which I appreciate, and putting together the show. I will be back next Sunday and every Sunday, at least for a few more months, through probably the month of May. The filibuster reform is really becoming a bigger and bigger topic. Hopefully sometime in the next week or two I will have the chance to make one of my edited, produced videos about that, my own idea for filibuster reform, which I won't go into at this point because I want to finish up the show. But I did promise a Dash and Sandy or Dandy clip that I would show you, and I've been focusing around the food bowl and the feeding. One other thing that Dash and Sandy can often agree on is looking out the front door. I've shown the Dash and Sandy looking out the front door clips before. This is, I know, kind of a letdown from the Dash eats sardine, Dash the cat eats sardine, and Sandy the dog gets bacon clip last week, which was years, literally years in the making. The budget for that clip was tremendous. Just the sardines alone, those were wild fresh sardines. But anyway, I hope this isn't too much of a letdown. It's just Dash and Sandy both like looking out the front door this morning together over here. So anyway, that's the show. I'll see you next Sunday, or if I have some reason to upload a video or create a live stream before next Sunday, then I guess I'll see you then. But until next Sunday, or until that happens, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.